Ethics. Look, I get it if that word doesn't excite you. It's something as Air Force officers we're probably tired of talking about. I believe that that's because we talk about it wrong, which is why here at SOS we don't want to talk about ethics, we want to talk to you about ethical reasoning. I'm here to convince you of three things. One, that we should talk about this. Two, that it's both important and interesting. And three, that we probably have something to teach you about your own ethical reasoning that you may not have thought about before. In order to prove to you that this can be important, I want to start with a vignette. There I was on the warrior side of Bagram Air Base, around about 2004, deployed with my best mate. We'd been roommates before, we'd followed each other through pilot training. This was a friend of my wife. My children called him Uncle. And we found ourselves, when the klaxon went off, just a little too blasé about the situation. The mortar round that ripped through the tent in front of us should have exploded on contact. To this day, I don't know why it didn't. But when it fizzled there on the ground, everyone in that tent, all 10 of us, immediately had an ethical decision to make. What action do we take in this moment that is right or wrong for our Air Force? So I did the only thing that I could think of, and I threw my buddy on top of that mortar round. Doesn't sound right, does it? You're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, that doesn't align with our core, that doesn't sound right. But who can articulate to me a cogent argument as to why? Why doesn't that resonate with us? Why does that seem like the wrong action at the time? Because these are the sorts of things that we can improve upon. Our ability to argue for or against certain actions by developing our ethical reasoning skills. Because often our ethical arguments only go that deep. That sounds wrong. That's just not right. It becomes an exercise in expressing your axioms to one another. Who can be louder? Who can get the last word in? It's like arguing on the internet. And we need to be better than that. These are the skills that we can pass on to you. Skills that help you argue for right or wrong. And this is an important thing to have. We need to have these arguments better than we're having them today. Because these situations, especially in the military, will be a part of your careers. They will be things that you have to face. And the more you think about them now, the more prepared you can be for them in the future. And the skills we want to teach you can help you, whether you're right or wrong in your arguments. If you go into an ethical argument and you're correct, the skills we're teaching you can help you articulate why. And getting into that argument can help you strengthen your own moral positions against people that want to try and argue against you. But if you go into an ethical argument and you happen to be wrong, and you should always, somewhere in the back of your mind, have a tiny sliver of doubt that you might be wrong, or it's not worth having the argument, then these skills might help you figure out why. What did you overlook? What did you not think about? Is there another perspective you could look at the problem through to figure out why someone else might feel like your decision was right or wrong? Without these skills, it's difficult to construct an argument against not throwing my buddy onto that mortar round, because I can construct an argument for it in three parts. First, I saved lives. If I hadn't thrown my friend onto that mortar round, 10 people will be dead. But because I did, only one died. Few people are going to argue that one life outweighs 10. Two, I already told you I had a wife. I had children. He was a bachelor with a single mom. Fewer family relationships were destroyed because I sacrificed my friend. And three, I made the flying schedule easier. I was a qualified IP and flight lead, and he was just a wingman. It was easier to fly our lines on Monday. Sounds good, right? No, of course not. None of you are convinced. But again, who can articulate to me why you're not convinced? I can. Because I only gave you 1/3 of an argument. You see, the schools of ethical reasoning are broken into three major frameworks: consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics. Consequentialism is talking about outcomes. It's talking about what happens in the end, and it wants to judge right or wrong by the results of your actions. Deontology is talking about the act itself. What rules should we follow in order to be ethical, and what duty do we have to follow those rules? And virtue ethics talks about the agent themselves. It talks about your motivations. Why did you do something? When I talked to you about my reasons for throwing my buddy on the mortar round, I gave you three consequential arguments. In the end, I saved more lives. In the end, I save more family relationships. In the end, I save more qualifications. But I didn't talk about the how or the why, which is why it felt incomplete. Now, these three ethical theories make up most of what we talk about in our ethical reasoning block, because they cover just about everything that we want to cover: the ends, the ways, and the means that we get in there. But let's dive a little bit deeper, and I don't want you to focus on the vocabulary that we're going to use here. I want you to focus on the way that I am talking about these different frameworks, outlining how they go about figuring out what is right or wrong. Consequentialists, again, talk about the ends. Is this always a bad thing, just because it led to that terrible outcome that day in Bagram? No, it's not. It has its time and it has its place. Think of a life raft. You've got 6 people stranded on this life raft. They've got enough water to get 4 of them to the shore. What's the right thing to do? Most people will say, well, find a way to save the 4. And you have to sacrifice 2 to do that. It's often enunciated as the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And this can be applicable at times, but it is not a complete argument. And there's many things that can argue against it. First off, if I'm only interested in the consequences of my actions, the outcome, then I can't really decide if I've done right or wrong until after I've done something and see what resulted. We'd like to be able to predict what our actions can do. We'd like to be able to say, well, if I do X, Y will occur, but we don't always know. So this isn't very prescriptive. It doesn't give me a lot of advice before I act about what's going on. It simply says, look at the results and go on. Another problem with consequentialism is that the ends can often justify the means, and we know the sorts of problems that we can get into when we talk about that. Hey, I saved those lives, but we don't talk about how. And that brings us to the need to talk about that how, which is where deontology takes over. Now, deontology is largely about rules. But it doesn't mean that if I'm a deontologist, I believe because there's a rule, I should follow it. Instead, deontology literally, meaning the study of rules, is talking about we will determine whether or not an act was right or wrong based upon whether I could make a rule out of it. And if I made a rule out of that, would that largely lead to a better society for all of us? Think of it this way. If we were to take my actions inside the tent, whenever I am in mortal danger, throw my friend upon it to get out of it. Think of what would happen if we turned that into the guiding principle for how we wanted to react in any dangerous situation. It would be chaos. It would be terrible. And deontology helps us through those by giving people expectations for one another. Right? One famous example of a deontological stipulation would be the 10 Commandments. Here are 10 rules that we have determined to be ethical. And if you live by these 10 rules, you will be doing good. Now, does it always work? Well, we don't know, because it's difficult to make rules about every single situation that's out there. But they can be helpful. Why? Think of the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If we have these rules and we put onto people an obligation or a duty to follow those rules, then we have expectations. I know what other people will probably do in a situation. I can penalize them with reciprocity if they don't live up to those duties. It gives a precedent for what we can expect of one another in a civil society. But as we said, you can't make rules for everything. And oftentimes, because of context, because of situations, somebody might follow a rule and end up doing much worse in the end than they ever planned to. The old adage, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. That's where consequentialism can come in and help deontology. Let's look at both the rules that we followed, the acts that we did, and the outcomes. Did it produce what we wanted in the end? When you get to strict deontology, you can also find a slippery slope towards unethical behavior, just like the ends justifying the means. How many times did we hear in the Nuremberg trials the defense, I was just following orders? If we're going to have a very deontological outlook on, wow, just the rules and the duties will determine right and wrong, we better make sure we get those rules right, because someone who follows a rule in the wrong context and does bad can simply say, but I was doing my duty. Which is why we as Air Force officers are charged not to follow every order or every rule, but lawful orders, ethical rules. They want us to think about these things in a way. And this is where virtue ethics comes in. Virtue ethics is more worried about the agent themselves, particularly the motivations. And virtue ethicists believe simply good decision makers make good decisions. But what's a good decision maker? For them, it's one who is virtuous. What's the definition of virtuous? One who contains more virtues. Now, virtues are just things that are good. The classic Greeks would talk about wisdom, courage, temperance, justice. These are things that they would argue simply are good. They're separate from people. So if I want to make you more virtuous, I need to find a way to get more wisdom, justice, temperance, courage into your decision making. I train you to think in those ways. I train you to believe in those things. And once you do, and you incorporate them into your decision making, you'll make the right decision in those sticky situations when you might not be able to predict the ends too well, or we don't have a rule to cover that situation. The difficulty with virtue ethics is that there's arguments over what those virtues might actually be. If you ask an ancient Greek, they're going to give you a different answer as to what is good than if you asked a modern-day Catholic who might believe in things like charity and sacrifice over some of the other virtues like courage and temperance. Not only that, but you're then obligated as a virtue ethicist to figure out a way to get those virtues into a person. What does it mean to train them to be more virtuous? Along those lines, if I manage to make a virtuous person and then I rely on him to make virtuous decisions, what does that say about the authority I have over them to dictate what they should do? Think of it this way. I've just told you you only need to follow the right rules. Well, who gets to decide what the right rules are? Can I make a rule for that? Can I make a rule which tells me which rules to follow? Or do I simply trust the judgment of that person who I deem virtuous? And if I do deem them virtuous, and they suddenly start to think, well, I'm so virtuous, none of these rules apply to me, I'll make my own rules, well, we get onto that slippery slope again of power corrupting and absolute power corrupting absolutely. So you see, no one framework can cover every situation of what is right or wrong. Each one has certain benefits in situations and certain downfalls. And what we hope is rather than you seeing these as three distinct frameworks through which you should view things, you simply see them as three perspectives to see the same object. We hope that in a situation, all three of these perspectives will provide you with the same answer. That when a sticky situation comes up, you will figure out what is right because it produces the right thing in the end, it does follow the rules, and it falls in line with what we would call virtuous, our core values in the Air Force. When those three things overlap, it's easy to say what is right or wrong. But oftentimes these things diverge. And when they do, we find ourselves in an ethical dilemma. Deontology may say, do action A, but not B. Whereas consequentialism says, no, do action B, but not A. You're forced with a choice between two wrongs or two rights, and you have to decide between them. In that situation, which of those ethical frameworks should you apply? That is why we want to work on your ethical reasoning skills, so that you can identify which of those perspectives are talking to you in the moment. Which ones are you articulating to other folks as your argument for why you should do what you should do? As we saw at the beginning, I gave you a largely consequential argument. Maybe it didn't speak to you because I only saved 9 people by sacrificing 1. What if that had been 90 people? What if it had been 900 people? 9,000? What if I was torturing someone for nuclear codes, and by sacrificing 1 person, I could save 9 million? You see, different frameworks will apply at different times. In those lucky cases when we find all 3 of them overlapping and applying to the same situation, what you find yourself in then is not an ethical dilemma, but perhaps a test of integrity. Because simply because you know what is right or wrong to do does not mean that that will be easy to do. It will be up to you to harness the moral courage, something we'll talk about in this ethics block, to act on what you know is right. You'll see this in cases of whistleblowers. You'll see this in your own flight room when you need to speak up, when you know that the things that are being said may not be right. Right? You'll know that this is the right thing to do, but you still need to summon the courage to do it. What I want to offer to you is that these perspectives can help you figure out or articulate an argument for why or why not that is the right thing to do. Another dichotomy I need to talk to you within ethical reasoning is the difference between moral relativism and moral absolutism. You see, I've given you 3 frameworks that allow you different perspectives to judge a particular moral act. But these are more about how should I view ethical reasoning in and of itself. You see, this started long ago during the rule of King Darius. He was looking at two societies. There was the Colossians and the Greeks. And they were very different people. And he brought them in one time to talk to them about how they handled their dead. And he looked at the Colossians and said, "What would you do with your father if he died?" They said, "Well, I would consume his body." And he asked the Greeks, "What would you do with the body of your dead father?" And they said, "Well, I would burn it on a funeral pyre." King Darius asked the Colossians, "Does that sound right to you? What would it take to convince you to burn your father's body rather than consume it?" And the Colossians said, "Nothing. Nothing could convince us of that. In fact, I would go to war and destroy another society to prevent ever being forced to light my dead father on fire." The Greeks said the same thing. What? Well, of course it's the right thing to do to light my father on fire. I would never consume the body of my father. In fact, you couldn't force me to. I would go to war and sacrifice everything that I believe in to keep from ever having to eat the body of my dead ancestors. From this, King Darius took away the idea that our moral constructs, the things that form the foundations of our society, are all relative. It depends. One society may believe one thing, one may believe another. Because of that, there is no universal moral standard. And if there's no universal moral standard, none of us really has a right to impose our moral viewpoints onto another society. But is that correct? The moral absolutists come along and say, you know what, that's not a complete argument, because sometimes those beliefs don't reflect reality. Imagine two societies that disagree over why the sun rises and sets. We may say, you know what, I believe that the earth is orbiting the sun, and because it spins on its axis, I get day and night. And the ancient Aztecs may say, no, the sun comes up every day because I cut the heart out of a slave and throw it down the stairs. We may be both willing to go to war and destroy one another for our beliefs, but only one is scientifically accurate. Is the same thing true about moral arguments? Is one more accurate or more correct than another? Well, an absolutist will argue, yes, it can be, and we can find that truth. They also argue that a lot of times the differences between these societies aren't as stark as they seem. You see, the Colossians and the Greeks, they both believed that what they were doing was somehow prolonging the spirit of their ancestors. The Colossians would consume their father so that they had part of their father in them. And then they could even pass that to their children on afterwards. It was a way of keeping them alive in perpetuity. The Greeks believed that by burning the body, they were somehow releasing this spirit so that it could live on around us. See, they were both worried about the same thing, not dying completely, but living on in perpetuity. They just had very different disagreements on the means by which that happened. Does that truly mean that their cultures believe different things? We don't know. So why do we bring up this dichotomy? Because whether you're a moral absolutist or a moral relativist leads you to try to approach your ethical reasoning in different ways. If you're a moral absolutist, you are looking for the answer to what is right or wrong. And once you've found that answer, there is often the idea or the need or the urge or the justification to spread that particular version of what is right or wrong. If you're relativists, you say that not only is that pursuit foolhardy, but it's dangerous. We should really live and let live. Allow people to find what works for them. Let's just find the best solution, not the right solution. Because when we're dealing with ethical dilemmas, there really is no 100% correct solution. There's only your choice of the lesser of two evils. As you go through this ethics block and talk through these three frameworks and this dichotomy of moral absolutism towards or relativism, I want you to try to identify within yourselves which of these speak to you. Which of these sounds the most like the sorts of justifications I use in my moral arguments? That's really what we want you to reflect on. Not memorizing what these schools are, what these terms mean, or how they think about things, but how do you see things? Are you seeing it myopically, only one way? Do you understand the other perspectives and how they could be there? Because the truth is, your own moral reasoning is part of you, whether you reflect on it or not. Every piece of information that passes into your brain goes through a filter. Every fact, every argument, everything you observe is first weighed by your brain as to whether or not I should believe that. Should I accept it as true? And your moral reasoning is the foundation, the quick thinking that accepts or rejects a lot of those facts before you even have a chance to cognitively process them. It is part of the way you decide. It is part of the way you think. So you owe it to yourself to develop that part of you, to take these 6.5 weeks and think on these issues. Use the definitions and the terms that we've talked about here to figure out, why do you believe what you believe? Should you believe what you believe? Are there other things that you hadn't considered before that may alter the way you believe or perceive what is right or wrong? So that when you find yourselves in situations like the one in Bagram, you don't have to make that decision for the first time. You've already thought about it. You've thought through it. And you've got some sort of foundation in your ethical reasoning that can serve as a platform to jump off and make those decisions. Thanks for listening today, and I hope you enjoy the Ethics Block.